Hi, my name is Heather Forrest. I'm a storyteller, an author of folk tale books, and a musician. And today I'm going to share some folk tales with you, told in my own words, in my own way. So here are my versions of some very old stories. Gather round and listen for a spell. I have stories to tell. And the very first story I have for you is the story of the baker's dozen. It's a legend that comes from New York State long ago, and it is my very first book. The Baker's Dozen is a colonial American folk tale. It features a man whose name is Volkart Jan Pietersen van Amsterdam, who, it is said, lived in the little town of Beverwyck, which is nowadays called Albany, the capital of New York. But in 1655, it was a little Dutch village on the Hudson River. And in that village, there was a bakery store, and the baker was Volkart Jan Pietersen van Amsterdam. And one day, they say, a very strange thing happened in his bakery store that caused him to start a custom, the custom of giving 13 in a baker's dozen instead of an ordinary 12. And that custom has persisted all the way to modern times. Well, here's how they say that custom came to be. Van Amsterdam was a baker of great renown. People would come for miles to buy his goods in Albany town. He made breads and cakes and muffins of every conceivable kind, but he had invented a pastry of his very own design. One day, close to the winter holidays, Van Amsterdam was rolling out his cookie dough in his shop, daydreaming about life back in Holland before he set sail on a great ship and crossed the Atlantic Ocean to come to what he called the New World. Well, he was daydreaming about his youth, and he remembered how his mother used to make giant gingerbread cookies in the shape of St. Claus or St. Nicholas. Well, with that memory, he took a knife and he carved the shape of a round, jolly man out of the dough he'd rolled out. He used 2 raisins for eyes and a little walnut for a mouth. And then he put the giant cookie into his oven and baked it. And when it was done, he brought it out and he mixed up red and white icing and he painted the thing to look just like St. Claus. And he took the St. Nicholas cookie and put it in his shop's window as a decoration. Well, passerbys looked into the window, and one was so excited. He came into the shop and said, Van Amsterdam, I haven't seen a cookie like that since I was a little boy back in Holland, long before I came to this new world. Oh, what sweet memories it brings. I want enough to give every single one of my grandchildren one of those prize cookies. Well, I've only made one, said Van Amsterdam, but I suppose if you come back later, I'll have as many as you like. Well, Van Amsterdam spent the rest of the day rolling out and cutting and baking and decorating those fine cookies. Well, before long, everybody in the village of Beverwyck wanted one of those cookies for their holiday table, and soon his shop was filled with people who came to buy his famous St. Nicholas cookies. While they were there, well, they also bought his pies and his cakes and his muffins as well. And, well, it didn't take long before Van Amsterdam found himself to be quite prosperous, rich, you might say. And one night in the back of his shop, as he was counting out his money, a new thought occurred to him. If I use just a little less butter, No one will know if I use just one less egg. They'll scarcely be able to tell if I use just a little less honey. Then there will be more money for me. And no one noticed. No one noticed when Van Amsterdam started to use just a little bit less of his fine quality ingredients in his baking. No one noticed because Van Amsterdam had become famous. People had stopped judging the quality of his goods, for his goods were famous now too. That's when it happened. Into his shop one day, there came an old woman. She had a long black shawl over her head. She lifted a gnarled finger and said, Van Amsterdam, I know all about you, and I've come to purchase 1 dozen of your famous St. Nicholas cookies. Oh, very well, and glad to have a sale. Van Amsterdam took a cloth bag, and into the bag he put exactly 12 cookies, tied it around with a string, took the woman's coin and gave her the bag. Well, before she left the shop, she opened the bag and looked in, and she counted the cookies carefully. She looked up, complaining. You have cheated a nice old woman. I gave you a good coin. I asked for 12 cookies, and look here. Look in the bag. You've only given me 12. A dozen means 12. A dozen means 13, and you are a greedy old man. Ooh, Van Amsterdam was a proud man. He did not like to be judged harshly by anyone, and so he said, How dare you call me greedy? I am Volkart Jan Pierson van Amsterdam, the fine, the honest, and the famous baker. How dare you call me greedy? A dozen means 12, and not one more. Greedy indeed. Get out! Get out of my store! And he swept the old woman out the door. Oh, you'll be sorry for such rudeness. Van Amsterdam. Well, the next day, when Van Amsterdam went to his shop, he opened his ovens to take out the loaves, and he saw that the breads had risen so high he couldn't even get it out of the oven. He made pies. He put sugar and honey. But no matter how much sweetener he put in the filling, every slice was sour. His cookies, they were suddenly so hard they couldn't be bitten. Every single thing he made came out wrong. Oh, what's happening? What's happening to me? Well, maybe I've been working too hard. I'll get a good night's sleep, and tomorrow, he thought, it will be better. But the next day it was no better. The next day, everything he made tasted terrible. Oh, it didn't take long before people who came to his shop to buy his famous pies and cakes and cookies and muffins, and of course the St. Nicholas cookies, well, they were scarcely on the street before their hand was in the bag with their purchases, tempted before they even got home to eat. Oh, that might have been a very famous cookie, but it tastes terrible. And soon, people stopped coming. And when no customers came, Van Amsterdam stopped baking. One day, as he sat in his shop, eyeing his empty shelves, for now he had nothing left to sell except a little pile of leftover St. Nicholas cookies, he wondered, how did this happen? How did my fortune go from so good to so bad? And that old proud man, he began to cry. Well, maybe it was the tear, that's it. The tears in his eye that made the world move. But he looked over at that pile of St. Nicholas cookies, and he thought he saw the mouth on one of them moving. And he heard a voice. It said, "You'll never be rich, Van Amsterdam, because you're greedy." Oh, and I've gone mad as well. And suddenly there was a knock at the door, and who do you imagine should return but that old woman wearing the long black shawl over her head? She lifted a gnarled finger and said, "I've come back. Now, I would like to purchase 1 dozen of your famous St. Nicholas cookies." Oh, wide-eyed and trembling, Van Amsterdam reached for a bag, and into that bag he put exactly 12. And then 1 more. He handed the bag to the woman. He took her coin. She opened the bag and counted the cookies carefully. She looked up and said, "Thank you." Well, word went through the town. Have you heard? Have you heard? At Van Amsterdam's shop, he's giving 13 a dozen instead of 12. Well, people started coming back to his shop. They were coming back to buy that baker's dozen. And soon all the other bakers in town noticed long lines in front of Van Amsterdam's store, so they too started to give 13 in a dozen. And the custom, well, it quickly spread throughout the colonies, for the merchants had discovered an important secret of success. When generosity replaces greed, good fortune follows. And soon in many a bakery store, a dozen meant 12, and then 1 more. The baker's dozen, giving an extra measure, more than you have to, is always a good idea. The next story I'd like to share with you is also a book entitled Feathers. It's a metaphorical story that's not really about feathers at all. It's about the power of words. Listen in for how feathers come to represent words in this story that comes from Eastern Europe. Words like feathers fly in the wind, reaching far and wide in the wind. Careless words tossed about cannot again be swallowed up. Tongues like swords can cut the heart. Words fly out, a rumor starts, cruel words like feathers fly. Try and try to gather them again, but they fly away in the wind. Once long ago in a village in Eastern Europe, there was a woman whose tongue was sharp and unkind. She was accused of starting a rumor. She was brought before the village rabbi protesting. "What I said was in jest, just humor. My words were carried forth by others, so I am not to blame." But the victim of the rumor cried for justice, saying, "What she said about me wasn't true, and now everyone else is saying it too. My heart is broken. I'm so embarrassed. She has ruined my own good name." "I can make amends," said the woman accused. "I know. I'll just take back my words and assume I am excused." The wise old rabbi listened to what the woman said, and he sighed as he shook his head. She does not comprehend her crime. She'll do it again, he thought in time. And because he was wise, he knew that the best teacher is sometimes an experience. And so he said to the woman accused, "No, your cruel words cannot be excused until you take my feather pillow to the market square, cut it open, and let the feathers fly through the air. When this is done, bring me back the feathers, every single one." The woman reluctantly agreed, thinking the wise old rabbi had gone mad indeed. But she took his feather pillow to the market square. She cut it open, and the feathers flew through the air. She tried to catch, she tried to snatch, she tried to collect each one, but weary with effort, she quickly discovered the task could not be done. She returned with only a few of the feathers in her hand. She said, I couldn't collect them all. They've scattered all over the land. I suppose," she sighed as she lowered her head, "they are like those words I can't take back from the rumor I spread. Cruel words, like feathers fly. Cruel words reach far and wide. They leave the mouth a bitter rind. May all your words, my friends, be kind." I once told that story in a library where there were families, and one family brought a small child. He might have been almost in kindergarten, and he sat on the floor in front of their knees and listened. And as I was telling that particular story, I looked over at the little boy and I was wondering, I'm not sure he understands this story. I keep talking about feathers. Maybe he thinks it's about feathers, but it's a metaphor. I'm not sure that he understands I'm really talking about words. And after the concert, the little boy came up to me and he said, "Miss Forrest, I liked your stories, and the one I liked the best was the one about feathers." And I said, "Really? Well, did you understand that story?" And he said, "I did understand it. It's just like toothpaste." Toothpaste? What does my story have to do with toothpaste? And he said, "Well, I got into trouble for this just the other day. Have you ever noticed that when you squeeze all the toothpaste out of the toothpaste tube, you can't put it back in again?" I had to laugh. Indeed, he did understand the story, because it is like toothpaste. Once those mean words come out of your mouth, it is very hard to take them back again. May all your words be kind. Here's another tale I'd like to share with you. It's an old Aesop's fable called The Contest Between the Sun and the Wind. And this story is 2,500 years old. Not my book, but the plot that my book expresses was made up by a man who lived in ancient Greece long ago. He's famous for telling fables. Fables are stories where animals or things in nature talk and act just like people. This is a story about the sun and the wind, but it's also a tale about the power of gentleness. It's such a famous fable that some of you might have heard of it before. And if you know this tale, listen to how I tell it, in poetry and with song. And if you don't know this 2,500-year-old fable, which is about a contest, see if you can guess who's going to win. There once was a man in a warm coat, walking his way down a winding road. The sun and the wind high in the sky watched the man as he walked by. The sun and the wind had a conversation. The wind said to the sun, "I'm the strongest one. I'm stronger than you." Sun said, "No, you're not. All your boasting and your pride makes me want to challenge you to a test. We'll see who's strongest." A contest, said the wind. Well, then let's do something exciting. An avalanche, a hurricane, a tidal wave. No, I wasn't thinking of anything quite that violent. Wind, look down. And the wind turned a huge cloud face toward the earth and saw that man I was just singing about. He was walking along wearing a nice new warm winter coat. Sun said, "Here's the contest I propose. Which of us can take the coat off of that man? Which of us can take the coat off of that man?" "Oh, take the coat from the man," said the wind. "That's too easy. You watch me. I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow to the brim and I'll rip that coat right off of him. I'll smash him into trees, take his coat off with ease, because brute force works all the time." And here's what happened. The wind blew hard down the road, but the man held ever more tight to his coat. The wind blew loud, the wind blew cold. The shivering man, he buttoned up his coat. It blew so hard the birds clung to the trees. The world was dust and swirling leaves. The harder the wind blew down the road, the tighter that man clung to his coat. Then it was the sun's turn. Sun came out from behind a cloud, warmed the air and the frosty ground. The man on the road unbuttoned his coat. He lifted his voice and he sang out loud. Oh, it's suddenly such a nice day, he thought. Well, then the sun grew even brighter and brighter and brighter, and the man started to feel so hot. He took off his coat and sat down in a shady spot. Meanwhile, up in the sky, the sun and the wind continued their conversation. Wind didn't even bother to look down to see if the sun took the man's coat off. Went off blowing up a storm on the other side of the world. Finally returned and said, "I huffed and I puffed and I blew to the brim, but I couldn't force that man's coat off of him. I can't imagine that you were able to either." Wind stopped boasting long enough to look down, and lo and behold, which means look and see, there was that man. He was under the shade of a tree, and his coat was nicely folded up under his head like a pillow. Wind said, "How did you do that? How'd you force that man to take off his coat?" And the sun said, I didn't force him. He took off his own coat. I was gentle. I lit the day through gentleness. I won my way. "Oh, that's amazing," said the wind. "There must have been a trick. Something else you did." "Oh," said the sun, "there was one more thing, but it wasn't a trick. It's a skill. I'll show you." And the sun just smiled. You can do lots of things, they say, in this world with a smile. The next tale I'd like to tell you is from an anthology of mine called Wisdom Tales from Around the World. An anthology, unlike a picture book which holds one story, is a storybook with many tales. This is a collection of 50 folktales and fables from around the world worth talking about. And one of my favorite stories in this book addresses a big question asked in our modern world. Why do people fight? Well, the next time you have an argument with a dear friend or a neighbor, think about this old tale from the Congo. It's called Why Do People Fight? Or The Red and Blue Coat. La 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 la. There were once two friends. They were friends when they were small. They were friends when they learned to crawl. They were friends when they learned to walk. They were friends when they learned to talk. They've shared their laughter and their tears, their hopes and their fears, because they were friends. They even protected each other in the hunt. One day, while those two friends were hunting in the jungle for their family's food, one boy said to the other, What are we going to do when we grow up and it's time for us to be married? Why, if we marry women who live in different villages, they'll be in different places and we won't see each other's faces. For it was a custom of that time and of that place for a man to go and live in the village of his bride. I have an idea, said one to the other. I love you like a brother. When we're old enough to seek brides, let's see if we can find sisters. Sisters will want to live close to one another, and then we'll always be able to be friends. And that's just what they did. When those two boys grew up, they left the village and they walked 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 until they finally came to a village where there were two sisters, beautiful sisters. When they saw those two women, oh, they fell in love. And they courted those women with food and flowers and songs and stories. And soon those two women agreed to be their brides. And they were married and they built their houses facing one another. There was just enough space between the houses for a path, no wider than wide enough for one to walk, no wider than the border between two countries. And at the end of the workday, when they were finished in the fields, those two friends would sit in their doorways across the path, talking to each other. They'd share their laughter and their tears, their hopes and their fears, because they were friends. Their good conversation mingled with the cooking smells coming from each of their wives' cooking. Now one day, while those two friends were talking to each other, along came the village trickster. Ooh, he was a tricky man, because he loved to test things. When he saw those two friends talking so nicely to one another, he thought, I could make them fight. I could make them fight. I could make them fight. He went to the elders of the village and said, You know those two friends who came to our village and married sisters, who spent every night talking to each other in pleasant conversation? Well, I could make them fight. I could make them fight. I could make them fight. No, you could never make them fight, said the elders. Those two, don't you know their story? They were friends when they were small. They were friends when they could crawl. They were friends when they learned to walk. They were friends when they learned to talk. They've shared their laughter and their tears, their hopes and their fears. You could never, ever, 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 ever make them fight. Oh no? Well, watch. And that night, that tricky man went home and he made a funny coat. It was divided down the middle. One half of the coat was completely blue. The other half of the coat was completely red. The next night, when those two friends sat in front of their doorways talking to each other across the path, that tricky man put on his funny two-colored coat and he walked directly between them, making absolutely certain that they noticed him as he went by. He even waved and sang, la 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 la, 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 la. And they kept on walking. And the two friends, well, they kept on talking. One said to the other, "Friend, wasn't that a beautiful blue coat that man was wearing who just walked by?" "No." "Friend, the man that walked by, his coat was red." "You must have blinked. I know what I saw. I know what's true. The man who walked by us just now was wearing a coat that was blue." "Friend, I know what I saw, and I know what I said. The man who walked by just now was wearing a coat that was red." "Friend, sometimes I think you know everything. But you don't know everything, because I know what's true. The man walking by was wearing a coat that was blue. The man was wearing a coat that was red. Blue. Red. Blue. Red. Blue, red, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. They beat each other on the head. Blue, red, blue, red. You are not my friend. Blue, red, blue, red. Their wives came outside. There were their husbands rolling around in the dust, kicking and fighting and making a fuss. Blue, red, blue, red. What are you doing? Husbands, you were friends when you were small. You were friends when you could crawl. You were friends when you learned to walk. You were friends when you learned to talk. Why are you fighting? Stop. But they wouldn't stop. Blue, red, what I say is true, red, you are not my friend, blue, red. In the middle of all the fighting and fuss, the tricky man came back. But this time, he walked straight toward them so they could see his whole coat. La 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 la. When those two friends saw what he was wearing, they were outraged. "You tricked us. You made us fight. You started a war between us." "Don't blame me," said the tricky man. "I didn't make you fight. You're both wrong. And you're both right. What each of you said is completely true. You're fighting because you only looked at my coat from your own point of view." La 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 la. The kinds of stories I love to tell are folk tales. These are old stories that have been passed down from one generation to the next in cultures around the world. People have often asked me, "How did you become a storyteller? And now that you're an author of folktale books, where do you get your ideas for writing?" Well, the answer to those questions is simple indeed. Ever since I was young, I've loved to read. And my favorite stories are folk tales, and so it's no surprise that I grew up loving to tell those stories. And after a while, I wrote some of them down, and I became an author. And then a really exciting thing happened. It's what librarians do. They put my folktale books on my all-time favorite shelf in the library, 398.2. I've even written a song about that number because it's where the folk tales that I've always loved are kept. And I always know what to do. Looking for a folk tale in the library? Well, I go to that shelf with a magical number, 398.2. I've traveled around the whole wide world without ever leaving home. I go anywhere my imagination wants to roam. I take a look in a folk tale book and travel on the wings of words, soaring off to faraway places, ancient times, magical spaces. I find a fantasy view, reading a book from the library shelf marked 398.2. Don't forget that number. 398.2. Ask your librarian. 398.2. Then you can soar off to faraway places, ancient times, magical spaces. You'll find a fantasy view. Check out a book from the library shelf marked 398.2. Thank you, thank you, thank you for doing an amazing thing. Thank you all for listening. Without good listeners, storytelling wouldn't exist. Thank you for listening.